A little while ago, late one night, a friend asked me a really interesting question. If you could live in any video game world, which would it be? It got me thinking about game worlds, and I realised there were none in particular I wanted to live in. There were many that I thought were fascinating to be in while I played the game, like an infected scientific facility, a city under the ocean, Dunwall. But after picking up The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition, I think I found a world that I would actually like to inhabit. Hyrule from Ocarina of Time. Now don't get me wrong, Hyrule in Ocarina of Time is a land being sent down a dark path, with the arrival of Ganondorf and the killing of the Great Deku Tree, but if we think about what the world is like without these plot-driven factors, it's actually rather peaceful. The Gorons rolling down Death Mountain, the nearby Hyrule Castle bursting with life. Along a long, winding path hides the Zora diving from a waterfall, and the seemingly never-ending Hyrule field that stretches on for miles connecting these otherwise separated lands. I've not finished Ocarina of Time as of writing, but this world has drawn me in and made me want to fully explore it with each new location I visit. But as I recently made my way to Zora's Domain, along the winding path that followed the river, the branches of it spreading out and overlapping with all the different levels of elevation, I couldn't help but feel like I'd been here before. It got me to look back on my time with the rest of the game and the other locations I'd visited. And in retrospect, it all began to feel strangely familiar. The rhythm of the back and forth combat, locking on to engage a single target, entering dungeons which test a particular aspect of your skills, your abilities to navigate and come back to sections later, opening shortcuts. I felt as if I'd been here before, and then it hit me, like a ton of bricks. I was back in Lordran. I could trace a line of the DNA from the game that revolutionised the 2010s all the way back to what a lot of people say is one of, if not the best Zelda game ever made. Ocarina of Time and Dark Souls are remarkably similar. The moment I described when I was making my way to Zora's Domain, the winding paths hidden away out of sight where most would never look, reminded me of breaking through Blight Town, carefully descending the Great Hollow, and finally arriving in Ash Lake, the lowest point in the world where the sum total of the everlasting dragons remain. This place, at the bottom of the world, hidden behind illusory walls and guarded by some of the hardest hitting enemies in the game, is ethereal, unreal, unlike anything else the game has to offer. It's one of my favourite places. The Hydra fight can be a bit annoying to deal with, but once you have, you're free of threat for the most part, left to just bask in the atmosphere and stare off into the distance at the other trees and wonder where they might lead. You can kneel before the everlasting dragon, the last of his kind, or you can lob off his tail to get the dragon greatsword. There's no other game that has an equivalent to Ash Lake for me, an area that feels so alone and isolated yet doesn't spark horror, but peace. I always make sure to visit here whenever I run through this game, even if I don't need to. It's like coming home in a weird sense. But Ash Lake is not the best chapter in the tale of the Chosen Undead. It's extremely underused, if anything. A bonus area with one extra fight copied from Darkroot Basin, a few enemies from the garden, and some from Crystal Cave. It's entirely here for lore and speculation, not being necessary on any playthrough of the game unless you want the Dragon Greatsword I mentioned and some extra dragon scales to level it up. There are far better areas of Dark Souls, and I'm not entirely sure which one I like the most. What is Dark Souls' best chapter? Many would say the DLC is the best part of the game, Artorias of the Abyss. The struggle against the titular knight is often regarded as the best in the whole Soulsborne series. A duel with a master swordsman corrupted by the very power he set out to destroy, and I can't disagree with that assessment. It's a great fight, but everything else in the DLC is just fine. The area is relatively linear as far as Dark Souls goes, and the other fights are good, but nowhere near what I would call the best. The lore surrounding this DLC is what I think really propels it into the realm of brilliance. The story of Artorias and Sif is heartwarming yet bittersweet, and slaying this mythical figure that inspired hope in so many is, pardon the pun, soul-destroying. They say never meet your heroes. Well, we killed ours. I love this part of the game. I always look forward to my duel and descending further and further towards the abyss, standing right on a knife's edge between remaining on solid ground or being forever lost and corrupted by the darkness. Overcoming the great evil that threatens to wipe away these lands, but knowing that the credit will go to someone else to preserve a legacy. It's the best chapter in Dark Souls. If you return to the tutorial area of Dark Souls, the Northern Undead Asylum, you can acquire an item known as the Peculiar Doll. Many players miss this the first time through, as the method to return is not signposted to you at all. In fact, the path looks like you're getting to places you shouldn't. But if you get the doll, you can find a painting in the city of Anor Londo that can be inspected and you'll be dragged into Mario 64 style. You will awaken in the painted world of Ariamis and are trapped here until you can make it through to the optional boss fight. You can't warp away, you can't leave, until you've explored this realm. It's a very compact level, maximising its small space by layering elements vertically and allowing them to overlap. The space also loops back on itself in ways that call back to the first real area of the game, the Undead Burg. The same way that you fight through until you knock down a ladder back to the bonfire, in the painted world you battle through until you open a door back to the main town square, and eventually to the entrance of the level itself. Once opened up, it takes mere minutes to sprint from the bonfire to the boss, but this area still took me around 30 minutes on my most recent playthrough due to how tight the level design is. That's not even speaking for the fact that there are unique enemies here who don't show up anywhere else in the game. Even the boss fight is unique. Firstly, because it's one of the bosses you can choose to ignore. I counted about 3 of these in the whole game: Darksun Gwendolyn, the Stray Demon, and Crossbreed Priscilla. It is the player themselves who begins this encounter. You walk into the boss arena and the towering woman is not hostile in the slightest. She simply asks you to leave. The player initiates this battle by being the one to strike first, and only then is Priscilla a threat. She has the ability to make herself invisible, only being detectable via her footprints in the snow-covered ground. This is a unique mechanic that is never used again anywhere else, similar to the enemies of the main level. This optional side area, in what is probably the grandest looking of all the areas we visit, has so much effort put into it, from the level design to the enemies and the boss, and the player can completely skip past it with no consequences. I think for that alone, the painted world of Ariamis is Dark Souls' best chapter. A few minutes ago I mentioned the city of Anor Londo, but connected to that is an area only explorable after obtaining the Lord Vessel around the halfway point of the game, the Duke's Archives. They start off as quite a limited area with only a few short rooms before you find yourself face to face with Seath the Scaleless. Ah, good, you'll think, a quick area I can rattle through in 10 minutes that gets me one step closer to finishing the game. And then you realise you can't hurt Seath. Then you die. Instead of being sent back to the bonfire at the start of the area, you're sent to a new bonfire further in. This marks the only time death is used to progress further into a level, rather than being a punishment. From here, the size of the level balloons, being possibly the biggest contained area we explore, with walls adorned with bookshelves and crystals galore. This area will wind back on itself, and it can get very confusing due to how similar all the rooms look. Even once you've explored this labyrinth, you're not finished. You make it to a garden outside where the crystal golems attack you before entering the most frustrating area, the Crystal Cave. The floor here is invisible. Only the falling particles can guide you on where to step, but tread carefully, as walkways will suddenly vanish beneath your feet and you reach a corner that you had no idea was there. Luckily, the main path is fairly straightforward once you figure out your footing, but it's no less frustrating, as this is probably the longest run from the bonfire in the whole game. Should you perish, you spawn back in the archives and need to traverse the Golem Garden and the whole cave all over again, just for another shot at Seath. I love the art design and the scale of the Duke's archives. It's vast and expansive, but can I really call it the best chapter when I find it so frustrating? You can see why this is so hard to nail down. There are so many areas of Dark Souls that all do different things so well. Scale, effort, presentation, mechanical complexity, tight level design, incredible boss fights. Dark Souls does so many things so well that it's hard to pick out just one chapter of it that I would call the best. Maybe Dark Souls doesn't have a best chapter. When I think about my time in the game, I don't think about walking on thin beams in Anor Londo or being poisoned at the bottom of Blighttown, but instead I think about kicking down a ladder, opening a giant door and riding an elevator. Maybe the success of Dark Souls' world is not contained to just one area, but instead is threaded throughout in how it connects all these areas. That mental map that everyone who's played this game builds in their head. Coming back to Lordran is like returning to your hometown. You still know all the shortcuts, the roads you can use to avoid busy traffic, the paths that shorten your journey by 10 minutes. That deeply intimate knowledge of a place. Even weeks after finishing this game, I haven't forgotten one part of my journey. The beautiful garden, the glistening sunlit city, the fortress of traps and tricks, the town in ruin, the poisonous swamp. And if you set out to find it, hidden deep below, the lake. Good night.